The usual experience with the talk test is that if two people are exercising and having a conversation, one of them will eventually turn to the other and say something like, "If we are gonna keep talking, you are going to have to slow down." The talk test works on the premise that at about the intensity of VT1, or the first ventilatory threshold, the increase in ventilation is accomplished by an increase in breathing frequency. One of the requirements of comfortable speech is to be able to control breathing frequency. Thus, at the intensity of VT1, it is no longer possible to speak comfortably. The simple talk test has been shown to work fairly well as an index of the exercise intensity at VT1. The talk test has several advantages as a method of programming and monitoring exercise compared to using a given percentage of VO2 max or maximal heart rate, since it is based off an individual's unique metabolic or ventilatory responses to exercise and does not rely on the use of predicted maximal heart or prediction equations. In other words, the talk test is based on actual changes in ventilation due to physiological adaptations to increasing exercise intensities. It is very easy for practical measurement. No equipment is required. It can be easily learned, and it allows for personalized cardiorespiratory exercise program design. For most people, training at intensities at which the answer to the question, "Can you speak comfortably?" becomes less than an unequivocal yes may represent the ideal training intensity marker. To better understand the talk test, it is helpful to learn more about ventilatory thresholds. Ventilation refers to the process of moving air into and out of the lungs and is better known as breathing. During exercise, higher intensities cause an increase in breathing rates, which allows for more air to move into and out of the lungs. In other words, when exercise intensity progressively increases, so too does the amount of air moving into and out of the body, representing a somewhat linear relationship when exercising at submaximal levels. This initial increase in ventilation is primarily achieved by increasing tidal volume, or the amount of air that moves in and out of the lungs with each breath. However, as the intensity of exercise continues to increase, there is a point at which ventilation starts to increase in a nonlinear fashion relative to intensity. This crossover point represents VT1 and corresponds with, but is not identical to, the development of acidosis in the muscles and blood and increased lactate production. Acidosis is caused by the accumulation of proton ions that build up when ATP molecules are split and leads to a decrease in pH levels, creating a more acidic environment. At this point, the buildup of lactate is offset by blood buffers, or compounds that neutralize acidosis in the blood and muscle fibers. As exercise intensity further increases to near maximal levels, the frequency of breathing becomes more pronounced and is disproportionate to the increase in oxygen uptake. This rise in breathing rate at near maximal intensities represents a state of ventilation that is no longer directly linked to oxygen demand at the cellular level and associated with an increase in carbon dioxide production caused by the buffering of acid metabolites. Stated another way, initially there's a demand for more oxygen, and this demand is met by increasing tidal volume. But as exercise intensity continues to increase, so does the breathing rate. When exercise intensity continues to increase past the crossover point, ventilation rates begin to increase exponentially as oxygen demands outpace the oxygen delivery system and lactate begins to accumulate in the blood. Consequently, respiratory rates increase. However, this increase in breathing rate is not driven by the need to meet the demand for oxygen, but rather by the need to expire more CO2. In fact, during strenuous exercise, breathing frequency may increase from 12 to 15 breaths per minute at rest to 35 to 45 breaths per minute, while tidal volume increases from resting values of 0.4 to 1 liter up to 3 liters or greater in well-trained individuals. VT1 is approximately the highest intensity that can be sustained for 1 to 2 hours of exercise. The second disproportionate increase in ventilation is referred to as VT2, or the second ventilatory threshold. VT2 occurs at a point when lactate is now rapidly increasing with intensity and results in hyperventilation even relative to the extra CO2 being produced. At this point, blowing out the CO2 is no longer adequate to buffer the acidity that is developing with progressively more intense exercise. VT2 is equivalent to an important metabolic marker called the onset of blood lactate accumulation and represents the highest intensity that can be sustained for 30 to 60 minutes in well-trained individuals. This marker represents an exponential increase in the concentration of blood lactate, indicating an exercise intensity that can no longer be sustained for long periods, and the highest sustainable level of exercise intensity, which is a strong marker of exercise performance. A person rowing a boat is a common analogy used to describe what is occurring at a cellular level within the muscles at each ventilatory threshold. When exercising below the talk test threshold, this can be visualized as a person rowing a boat at a comfortable pace without any issues. Once exercising at and above the talk test threshold, but below VT2, the rowboat springs a small leak, which represents VT1, and the boat begins to take on water, representing proton accumulation and lactate. However, the water comes into the boat at such a rate that the rower can remove the water before it has the chance to significantly accumulate. Once exercise intensity reaches VT2, the hole in the boat becomes significantly larger, and no matter how hard the rower works to bail it out, the water begins to significantly accumulate. In its simplest form, VT1 can be identified by determining if you can talk comfortably or talk but not sing. Other options for assessing VT1 based on your ability to talk comfortably include reciting something familiar, such as saying the alphabet, or A is for apple, B is for boy, etc., then answer the question, can you speak comfortably? If the answer is yes, then the intensity is below VT1. At the first response that is less than an unequivocal yes, the intensity is probably right at that of VT1, and if the answer is no, the intensity is probably above VT1. When you can no longer say more than a few words between breaths, you are at or above VT2. To be clear, the talk test is simply looking at a client's ability to speak comfortably while exercising. If you can talk comfortably but not sing, then you are working at a moderate exercise intensity below VT1. If you are not sure if talking is comfortable, then you have most likely reached the crossover point and are exercising at a vigorous intensity or above VT1 but below VT2. If you definitely cannot talk comfortably while training, then you have reached VT2 or above and are exercising at near maximal levels. How hard should I be working, and how do I know if I am working hard enough, are common questions that you may have when exercising. There are many methods for monitoring exercise intensity that can be used based on your goals, access to equipment, level of comfort, and use of medication. The talk test and the use of markers for ventilatory thresholds offer a simple, reliable, and individualized method for monitoring exercise intensity.